Lorenzo DeLuca, once untouchable, now chained and burning in a warehouse, betrayed by the very men he trusted. But as the flames close in, a single mother steps into the fire to save him, risking everything. Can she escape the inferno before it consumes them both? Or will the Mafia boss be the death of her too? Hey, if you're loving this story, a quick like or subscribe goes a long way in helping me keep creating. And if you're up for it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every message, and it always makes my day. Lorenzo DeLuca, the ruthless 34-year-old mafia boss of the DeLuca family, had always been untouchable. His storm gray eyes, sharp jawline, and aura of dominance instilled fear in the hearts of those who crossed him. His name was spoken with reverence, whispered in dark corners, where even the bravest men dared not tread. But tonight, as flames consumed the old warehouse, he was no longer the untouchable kingpin. He was a man chained to his fate. The flames licked at the edges of the building, casting an orange glow over the industrial district of the city. The heat was unbearable. The thick smoke filled the air, choking the life out of everything it touched. Lorenzo's body was bruised and battered, the marks of betrayal etched across his skin. His expensive suit, once pristine and sharp, was now torn and blackened, a shadow of the man he once was. His wrists and ankles were shackled to a steel beam, the chains digging into his flesh as he pulled desperately, trying to break free. But no matter how hard he fought, the chains held fast, a cruel reminder of his downfall. He had been betrayed by his own men, those he once trusted, those who swore loyalty to him. The betrayal had come from within, from the very people who had been closest to him. The fire the beast set loose in the warehouse to finish him off were nothing but the final act in a calculated move to destroy him. Lorenzo had been left for dead, his enemies confident that the flames would be enough to wipe him out. But they had underestimated him. The man who had once ruled the criminal underworld with cold precision was not going to die quietly in the flames. In the midst of the inferno, Lorenzo's mind was sharp, despite the pain and exhaustion. He knew he didn't have much time. The heat was unbearable, the roar of the flames growing louder with every passing second. The wild animals circling outside the warehouse were just another obstacle. They had been set loose to finish what the fire could not. His enemies thought they had won, but they were wrong. They had underestimated Lorenzo DeLuca. Elena Carter had learned to live a life of quiet survival. At 29, she was a single mother, barely making ends meet in a small, worn-down apartment on the edge of the city. Her life had always been a careful balance, doing whatever it took to survive while keeping her 6-year-old son, Tommy, safe from the dangers of their world. She had never sought out trouble, and trouble had always avoided her. That was the way it had to be. For Tommy's sake, she had learned to keep her head down and never get involved. Her routine was predictable. Wake up early, go to work, and come home, and take care of Tommy. Simple, unremarkable. But tonight was different. Tonight, her world was about to change. Elena had been walking home from the grocery store with Tommy in tow, his little hand clutched tightly in hers as they navigated the darkened streets. The usual hum of the city was replaced by an eerie quiet, and the air felt thick with anticipation. They had taken a shortcut home through a quieter part of the city, where the old industrial buildings loomed like silent giants in the night. But tonight, the buildings weren't silent. One in particular was glowing in the distance, flames dancing in the windows. "What's that, Mommy?" Tommy asked, his wide eyes filled with curiosity. His grip on her hand tightened as they approached the alley. "I don't know, sweetie," Elena replied, her voice steady despite the unease creeping up her spine. The fire looked distant, but the closer they got, the more Elena felt a sense of dread wash over her. "Let's go home," she added quickly, turning to walk away from the flames. But Tommy wasn't listening. His small hand tugged at hers, pulling her toward the source of the glow. "Mommy, I hear someone," he said, his voice small but insistent. "Someone's calling for help." Elena froze. She hadn't heard anything, just the crackling of the fire in the distance, the wind pushing smoke toward them. But Tommy's voice was unwavering, his innocent certainty that someone needed help tugging at her heart. "Tommy, we need to go home," Elena said, trying to sound firm, but there was a flicker of doubt in her voice. She was scared, scared of the fire, scared of what might happen if they got too close. scared of what her son was asking her to do. But Tommy's eyes were wide, his small face filled with something Elena hadn't seen in him before. Concern. Real, genuine concern. "No, Mommy," Tommy said, his voice quieter now, but with an edge of determination. "I heard someone. Please, we have to help." Elena's mind raced. She had spent her whole life avoiding getting involved in anything dangerous. But Tommy's words, his trust in her, his belief that they could do something, shifted something deep inside her. She wasn't just a mother protecting her child anymore. She was the one who had to show her son what it meant to do the right thing, no matter the cost. With a deep breath, Elena made her decision. They would check. Just for a moment, she told herself, just to make sure no one was hurt. They reached the entrance of the warehouse, and the smoke was thick now, pushing them back as if the building itself was trying to keep them away. Elena's heart pounded as she looked at the imposing structure. The door was locked, the large loading bay sealed shut. But there was a smaller side entrance, its metal frame bent and broken, as if someone had tried to escape in a hurry. Tommy tugged at her hand again, urging her forward. "Mommy, we have to help. Someone's inside." Elena hesitated for a moment, every instinct telling her to turn away, to take Tommy and run as far as possible from the chaos and danger. But she couldn't. She couldn't walk away now. Not when Tommy was asking her to do the right thing. She found a pair of bolt cutters on the ground near the door, abandoned by whoever had tried to break in. Her hands were shaking as she took the heavy tool in her hands, the weight of the decision settling in her chest. This was it. There was no turning back now. With every ounce of strength she could muster, Elena stepped through the door. Her breath caught in her sternum as she entered the warehouse. The air was thick with smoke, the heat intense as the flames raged in the far corner of the room. Elena's eyes scanned the space, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. And then she saw him, a man chained to a steel beam in the center of the room, his body battered and bruised. His clothes were torn, blackened by the smoke and fire, and his face was hidden behind a veil of soot and blood. But even through the haze of smoke, Elena could see the determination in his eyes. They were the eyes of a man who wasn't ready to die, no matter what. "Help me," the man rasped, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Elena's heart stopped. He wasn't just any man. There was something about him, something that stirred a deep sense of recognition in her. But she didn't have time to think about it. The chains that bound him were thick, industrial, the kind used to tie down cargo. She had no idea how she was going to break them, but she had to try to. "Hold on," she said, her voice shaky as she knelt beside him, positioning the bolt cutters around one of the chains. Her arms trembled as she applied pressure, but the chain didn't budge. The fire was closing in, and time was running out. "Please," the man said, his voice rough with pain and desperation. "Hurry." Elena's hands shook harder as she repositioned the cutters, this time focusing on the links instead of the lock. She pressed down with all her strength, and the metal groaned in protest. Then, with a sickening snap, the chain gave way. "Got it," Elena gasped, her breath coming in shallow pants as she moved to the next chain. The man didn't speak, but his gaze was fixed on her, the intensity of his stare making Elena's heart race. She could feel the weight of his gaze even as she worked quickly, determined to free him before the fire consumed them both. With the last chain snapped, the man's body slumped forward, his chest heaving with exhaustion. Elena stood, pulling him to his feet, but he staggered slightly, leaning on her more than he had before. His body was heavy, his muscles straining against the pain of his injuries. "We need to go," Elena said, her voice trembling as she led him toward the door. Tommy stood at the threshold, his eyes wide with fear and awe as he watched the man Elena had just saved. But the fire was too close now, the heat unbearable. Elena's mind raced as she thought of the quickest way out, but every option seemed to lead them straight into the flames. And then, the roof groaned. Elena's eyes widened in panic. They were running out of time. She pulled the man forward, but he was slower now, his injuries taking their toll. The heat was almost unbearable, the smoke suffocating as they stumbled toward the door. The fire was closing in faster than she thought, and there was no way they could escape without more time. They had to get out. But at what cost? As they burst through the door, Elena felt the heat at her back, the roar of the flames pushing them out into the cool night air. Tommy was safe, but the man was weak. They had barely escaped. Elena's heart raced as she looked back at the burning warehouse, knowing that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. What had she just gotten herself into? The sharp scent of antiseptic filled the air as Elena stood over Lorenzo, watching him breathe in shallow, labored breaths. The flickering light from the old lamp cast eerie shadows across the room, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls of her small apartment were closing in on her. She had never imagined herself in this position, not with a man like him. Lorenzo DeLuca, the Mafia kingpin she had unknowingly saved, now lay unconscious on her sofa. His once regal appearance was marred by bloodstains, soot, and bruises, but even in his weakened state, there was something undeniably imposing about him. His sharp jawline and rugged features seemed carved from stone, and his storm-gray eyes, though closed, seemed to burn with an intensity that made Elena feel small in comparison. She had done it. She had saved him. But as the reality of the situation set in, a deep sense of unease gripped her. She was no longer the woman who had simply helped a stranger in need. She had just dragged a dangerous, powerful man from the flames and into her home. And in doing so, she had unknowingly invited danger into the very place she had worked so hard to protect. Elena walked softly toward the kitchen, her thoughts a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Her son, Tommy, was tucked into bed, fast asleep, blissfully unaware of the chaos unfolding just beyond the thin walls of their apartment. Tommy had insisted they help, and Elena had obeyed without question. She had known the dangers of helping a stranger, but Tommy's insistence had silenced her fears. She had believed, somewhere deep inside, that she could make a difference. But now, as she stood in her small kitchen, staring at the panicked whirlpool of her thoughts, Elena wasn't sure she had done the right thing. What had she brought into their lives? Her eyes flicked toward the living room, where Lorenzo still lay. He hadn't woken up since they had brought him inside. His body was limp, the strength that had once defined him now drained by the wounds and exhaustion. Elena could hear the faintest sounds of his breathing, the rise and fall of his chest slow but steady. She had managed to clean his wounds, bandage his cuts, and give him water, but his condition was still fragile. As she poured herself a glass of water, her thoughts raced. She had heard rumors about Lorenzo DeLuca. The name alone carried weight. He was the head of the DeLuca family, one of the most feared mafia organizations in the city. The stories about him were legendary, ruthless, cunning, untouchable. He had earned his reputation through violence and manipulation, climbing his way to the top of the criminal world. Elena had never imagined she would be in his presence, let alone save his life. She took a deep breath and set the glass down on the counter, her hands trembling slightly. What had she gotten herself into? The sound of movement from the living room startled her. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. Slowly, cautiously, Elena walked toward the doorframe and peered into the dimly lit room. Lorenzo was awake, his eyes half open, and his body was shifting slightly, as though he was trying to sit up. His movements were slow, deliberate, and there was a palpable tension in the air. "You're awake," Elena whispered, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. Lorenzo's gaze flickered toward her, his storm-gray eyes narrowing slightly as he focused on her. For a moment, there was no recognition in his eyes, only confusion. He blinked, and then his lips parted, though his voice was barely audible, rough from disuse. "Where am I?" he rasped. Elena swallowed hard, forcing her voice to steady itself. "You're in my apartment. You've been injured. I helped you." His eyes flickered to her face, a spark of suspicion igniting in the depths of his gaze. There was no gratitude, no warmth, only a silent assessment, as if he were trying to read her, to determine whether she was a threat or an ally. His silence stretched on, and Elena could feel her chest tightening under his stare. "Who are you?" Lorenzo asked, his voice still hoarse but carrying an edge of command. His posture was tense, though his strength was clearly drained, like a lion forced to acknowledge its vulnerability. It was a striking contrast to the man he had been just hours ago, the man who had been surrounded by flames fighting for survival. "My name is Elena," she replied, her voice steady despite the racing of her pulse. I couldn't just leave you to die." For a moment, Lorenzo said nothing, his gaze still assessing her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. He studied her as though she were an enigma he needed to solve, an obstacle in the path of his survival. "Wait a minute," he asked, his voice soft but his suspicion clear. "Why save me?" Elena hesitated. The question had been running through her mind for the past hour, ever since the adrenaline of the rescue had worn off. She hadn't expected this man, this mafia boss, to be so human. He wasn't some faceless villain, some monster she could easily dismiss. He was a man, raw and vulnerable, and that made her question everything. "I don't know," she said honestly, her voice quieter now. "I couldn't walk away. Not with you there. Not when I knew someone needed help." Lorenzo's gaze softened for just a moment before the familiar hardness returned. He shifted on the couch, wincing slightly as he attempted to sit up fully. "Who did this to me?" he asked, his voice low, dangerous. There was no doubt in Elena's mind that he was already calculating his next move, even in his weakened state. "The people you trust," she replied, her tone cautious. "You were left to die by your own men. Betrayed." Lorenzo's eyes flashed with a dangerous glint, and Elena felt a shiver run down her spine. Even now, in his weakened state, there was something terrifying about him. The way he carried himself, even in pain, spoke of a man who had been born to rule, to command, to dominate. "Victor Olaf," he muttered, his voice tight with rage. "That bastard?" Elena's stomach dropped. She had heard rumors of Victor Olaf, the rival mafia boss who had made a name for himself through brutal methods and calculated moves. But hearing Lorenzo speak his name with such venom made her realize the scale of the situation she had just stumbled into. As Lorenzo's eyes darkened, Elena realized she had made a mistake. She had let him into her life. She had pulled a man with the power to destroy entire families into her small, fragile world. What would this mean for Tommy? Could she protect her son from this life she had unwittingly allowed into their home? Her thoughts were interrupted when Lorenzo shifted again, this time with a little more force. He leaned forward, his storm gray eyes locking with hers, his gaze piercing and intense. "Get me a phone," he demanded, his voice low but commanding. "I need to make a call. I need to fix this." Elena hesitated. She had no intention of aiding this man in anything more than what was necessary to get him out of her home. But the fire still burned in his eyes, the same fire that had driven him to rise to the top of the mafia world. She knew she couldn't stop him. Not when he was this determined, this desperate. With a heavy sigh, she nodded. "I'll get it for you, but once you're healed, you need to leave." Lorenzo didn't respond. His eyes, cold and calculating as ever, never left hers. He wasn't the man she had imagined. He wasn't just the monster the city feared. Beneath that mask, there was a man, broken, vulnerable, and, in some twisted way, grateful for her help. But as the moment stretched on, Elena knew one thing for certain. She had just invited the most dangerous man in the city into her home, and now there was no turning back. Elena stepped into the hallway to retrieve a burner phone she kept in a drawer for emergencies, her mind racing with what she had just agreed to. The sound of Lorenzo's rasping breath echoed in the silence behind her. A constant reminder of the danger she had allowed into her life. What had she done? What would it cost her? The fire had only just begun. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of Elena's small living room, casting faint shadows across the worn furniture. The faint smell of coffee lingered in the air, but Elena couldn't taste it. Her mind was consumed by the events of the past 24 hours. Lorenzo was still resting, his injuries not yet fully healed, but his presence was undeniable. Every time Elena passed the living room, she saw him there, lying on her couch, the once mighty mafia boss, now a shell of the man he had been. His vulnerability unsettled her, yet she couldn't deny that there was something in his eyes that haunted her, something raw, something human. It had been a restless night for both of them. Elena, having just saved a notorious mafia boss, now found herself tangled in a web of secrets and betrayals. Her every thought circled around the gravity of what she had done and where it would lead her. She had helped Lorenzo out of compassion, but now she had to face the consequences. As Elena stepped into the living room, her eyes lingered on Lorenzo, still unconscious but breathing steadily. She had been so focused on the immediate danger, on saving him, that she hadn't considered the full scope of what bringing him into her life meant. And yet, despite the warning bells ringing in her head, Elena found herself drawn to him, compelled to understand the man behind the hardened mask. She sat in the chair across from him, the silence between them almost palpable. But it didn't last long. Lorenzo's eyelids fluttered, and a soft groan escaped his lips. His storm-gray eyes slowly opened, and the intensity in his gaze sent a shiver down Elena's spine. "Where am I?" he rasped again, his voice rougher now, laced with frustration. "You're in my apartment," Elena replied quietly, her voice steady. She had long since resigned herself to the fact that this wasn't just a rescue anymore. It was a decision that would change everything. "You were injured. I brought you here." Lorenzo's gaze shifted around the room, and then his eyes locked on hers. He seemed to be searching for something, answers, maybe, or an explanation. But before he could speak, Elena's phone rang, breaking the silence. She hesitated before answering, knowing that whatever was on the other end could only add to the case already unfolding. "Hello?" she said, her voice a little sharper than she intended. "Elena," a gruff voice on the other end said. "It's Dmitri." Her heart stopped. The name hit her like a punch to the gut. Dmitri, her ex-husband, the man who had disappeared 2 years ago, leaving her with nothing but broken promises and debts. The man who had haunted her every thought, every night she spent alone with Tommy. "What do you want?" Elena managed to say, her voice trembling despite her efforts to keep it calm. "I need to talk to you. It's about the DeLuca situation." Elena's pulse quickened. The mention of Lorenzo's name, DeLuca, sent a chill down her spine. "What do you know about that?" she asked, her voice tight. "Everything," Dmitri replied, his tone low and dangerous. "Victor Olaf isn't the only one you need to worry about. You're already tangled in a mess, Elena, one you can't get out of." The words hung in the air, and Elena felt her heart race. She could feel Lorenzo's eyes on her, though she couldn't bring herself to look at him just yet. "Where are you?" she demanded. "I'm not going to tell you that," Dmitri said, his voice a low growl. "But you need to listen. You've been caught in the middle of something far worse than you know, and I can't save you anymore." The line went dead before Elena could respond. Lorenzo, who had been silent throughout the conversation, finally spoke, his voice filled with an unsettling calm. "Dmitri." Elena's eyes snapped to him, her pulse racing. "What do you know about him?" Lorenzo shifted, the movement stiff and painful, but his voice was firm as he answered. "Dmitri Petrova. He was once a part of my operations. He worked for me, but I trusted him too much. He was a liability, and I should have handled him sooner. Now I see he's made the ultimate mistake." Elena's heart dropped. Dmitri, the man who had promised her a life of stability, a future with him and Tommy, was now tied to the very world she had been trying to escape. The man she had once loved, the father of her son, had betrayed her in ways she hadn't yet fully understood. "How was he involved?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lorenzo's expression darkened, his jaw clenched as if the mere thought of Dmitri caused him physical pain. "He betrayed me, sold me out to Victor Olaf, the same man who tried to have me killed. I don't know how far Dmitri's involvement goes, but I can guess." Lorenzo paused, his storm-gray eyes meeting hers, and for the first time Elena saw a flicker of something like regret in his gaze. "If he's tied to Olaf, then everything that's happened to you, to us, has been orchestrated by him." Elena's breath caught in her throat. The revelation hit her like a tidal wave. Dmitri wasn't just a runaway husband. He was a traitor, a key player in the very betrayal that had put her and Tommy in danger. Her mind reeled, trying to make sense of it all. She had thought Dmitri's disappearance had been just another failed relationship, just another man who couldn't live up to the promises he had made. But now she realized that his betrayal wasn't just personal, it was part of something far more dangerous. Something that had dragged her into a world of crime and violence that she had never wanted to be a part of. Lorenzo watched her, his gaze steady and unyielding. "You're not safe, Elena," he said softly. "Not with him involved, and certainly not with Olaf still breathing." The weight of his words settled heavily on Elena's chest. She had never wanted any of this. She had never wanted to be entangled in a world of power and betrayal. She had always just wanted to protect Tommy, to keep him safe from the mistakes of the past. But now, the past had come crashing into her life with a force that left her gasping for air. And yet, as much as she wanted to flee, as much as she wanted to escape, Elena couldn't. She had already made her choice when she saved Lorenzo. She had already stepped into a world darker than she had ever imagined. And as much as she hated to admit it, part of her wanted to know what came next. She wanted to understand the man Lorenzo was, not just the mafia boss the world feared, but the man he was when he was vulnerable, when he was human. Lorenzo's voice broke through her thoughts. "You're not the only one who's been betrayed, Elena. I trusted Dmitri. I trusted him to keep his loyalty to me, to my family. He failed. And now, the consequences are going to be worse than anything you can imagine." Elena swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do we do now?" Lorenzo's gaze softened for a fraction of a second. It was a subtle change, but it was there, an acknowledgement of their shared struggle, of the weight they both carried. "We survive," he said simply. "We fight back." Elena nodded slowly, her mind racing. The past was no longer just a memory. It was a living, breathing thing, a monster that had come to life and was now threatening everything she cared about. But in the face of that monster, Elena made a choice. She would fight. For Tommy, for herself. And maybe, just maybe, for Lorenzo. As Elena walked away from the living room, her mind heavy with the truth about Dmitri, she couldn't shake the feeling that something much worse was coming. Lorenzo had made it clear. There was no turning back now. The war had already begun. The storm had arrived quietly, without warning, but Elena could feel it gathering all around them. It wasn't the kind of storm you could see coming with dark clouds and flashing lightning. It was a storm that built in silence, a storm that crept through the cracks into the wall and whispered in the corners of her mind. Lorenzo De Luca, the mafia kingpin she had saved from the fire, was not just recovering from physical wounds. He was recovering from a life of betrayal. His body, once a symbol of strength, was now a fragile shell of the man he had been. But the fire had not only singed his skin, it had ignited something deep inside him, something more dangerous than any wound. The worst part? It was a storm she had invited into her home, into her life. She couldn't push it away anymore. She couldn't deny that their worlds had collided, that the fragile peace she had fought so hard to maintain was now shattered. And no matter how hard she tried to turn away, Elena knew there was no going back. The air in the apartment felt heavier than usual. Elena sat at the small kitchen table, her eyes flicking between the phone in her hand and the door to the living room where Lorenzo sat. His presence was a constant weight in the room, even in his weakened state. He was quiet now, still recovering, but Elena knew that silence was temporary. The calm before the storm. Lorenzo had been in and out of consciousness for the last few days, his strength coming back in slow, deliberate increments. The burn marks on his skin were healing, but the emotional scars, they were far from gone. He spent most of his time alone, staring out the window, his gaze distant and intense, as if the city beyond the glass held the answers to questions he hadn't yet asked. But the storm wasn't just about Lorenzo anymore. It was about Tommy. Her son had always been a curious, innocent child. He'd grown up with little, learning to make do with what they had, but never once complaining about it. He didn't know the world beyond their tiny apartment. He didn't understand the dark underbelly of the city. And Elena had worked hard to keep him away from that world, away from the violence, the bloodshed, and the shadows that stretched far beyond their modest lives. But Lorenzo had changed everything. Tommy's bond with him had grown stronger every day. It had started slowly, just small moments when Tommy would look at Lorenzo, his bright, curious eyes full of questions he wasn't sure how to ask. At first, Elena had been wary, watching her son interact with the dangerous man she had pulled from the flames. But what surprised her most was Tommy's instinctive trust in him. It wasn't just that Tommy didn't fear Lorenzo. He seemed to think of him as something else entirely, a protector, a figure of stability. The man who had once been at the top of the criminal underworld was now seen by her son as someone to admire, someone who could provide security even in the chaos. Tommy had no idea who Lorenzo truly was. He didn't understand the mafia world, the ruthless decisions, the blood-stained hands. But he saw something else, something more human in Lorenzo. He saw a man who needed help, who had been hurt, and who was trying to heal. It was an innocent bond, one that Elena wasn't sure was healthy, but it was there. And Tommy's innocence had shaken her more than she was willing to admit. The sound of footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. Lorenzo entered the kitchen, moving with a quiet grace despite his injury. His dark hair was unkempt, and his jaw was shadowed with a few days' worth of stubble. He had cleaned himself up, but there was something different about him now. His eyes, once cold and calculating, now seemed to hold a depth of emotion that Elena hadn't expected. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. The silence between them had become a familiar companion, a space where they both existed without saying much, where every glance held 1,000 unspoken words. "How are you feeling?" Elena asked, her voice cautious but soft. Lorenzo looked at her, his storm gray eyes narrowing slightly. "Better," he said, his voice rough but steady. "But it's not just the wounds that need healing." Elena couldn't meet his gaze. The weight of his words hung in the air, and she felt the stirrings of something inside her, a gnawing anxiety, a fear of what was to come. "What do you mean?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Lorenzo didn't answer right away. He moved toward the window and stood there, his broad shoulders tense as he looked out at the city below. "Victor Olaf is still looking for me," he said finally, "and I'm sure my people are too. They believe I'm dead, but once they figure out that I'm not." His voice trailed off, and Elena's stomach twisted. "What are you going to do?" she asked, almost afraid of the answer. "I'm going to protect you," Lorenzo said quietly, turning his gaze back to her. His eyes were fierce, but there was a flicker of something softer there, something she hadn't expected. "I'll handle this, but I need to take action before it's too late." Elena's heart raced. She hadn't wanted to be a part of this world. She hadn't wanted Tommy to be involved in the violence, the power struggles. But Lorenzo's words made it clear that there was no way out now. She had already crossed the line when she helped him. There was no going back. "I can't stay in hiding forever," Lorenzo continued, "and neither can you." His tone was firm, but it wasn't just a command. It was an invitation. "You and Tommy are tied to me now, whether you like it or not. I won't let anyone hurt you." Elena's mind raced. What had she gotten herself into? She had pulled a man like Lorenzo into their lives. A man who was ruthless, who was calculating, who had been betrayed by his own people. And now she had to decide. Would she continue to help him, continue to protect him, even though it meant stepping into a world she didn't understand? But the truth was, she didn't have a choice. Not anymore. Tommy appeared in the doorway holding his favorite teddy bear, Barnaby, his wide eyes full of innocence and trust locked onto Lorenzo. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, holding out the bear toward him. "Mr. DeLuca," Tommy said solemnly, his voice as serious as a 6-year-old's could be. "Barnaby says you need to smile. He's really good at helping people feel better." Lorenzo's lips twitched, and for a moment he looked almost human. He took the teddy bear gently from Tommy's small hands, and Elena saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something she hadn't expected. A softness, a vulnerability that he kept hidden beneath layers of cold detachment. He looked at Tommy with an expression she couldn't quite decipher before gently brushing a stray lock of Tommy's hair away. "Thank you, Tommy," Lorenzo said, his voice softer than it had been before. "You're a brave boy." Tommy beamed up at him, clearly pleased with the praise, and without saying another word, he ran off to play in the next room. Elena stood there, stunned by what had just happened. Lorenzo was no longer just the Mafia boss she had rescued from the flames. He was someone else now, someone who, despite his darkness, still had the capacity for kindness, at least to Tommy. Elena's thoughts were interrupted when Lorenzo turned to her again, his face hardening. "I'll need your help," he said, his tone changing back to the commanding one she had come to expect. "This isn't over. It won't be until I've taken care of things." "I'm not part of this world, Lorenzo," Elena said, her voice trembling. "I don't belong in it. I can't." "You already are, Elena," he cut in. "Whether you like it or not, you and Tommy are a part of this now. You saved me. Now I'll make sure no one can touch you." She met his gaze, and for a moment she saw the full weight of what he was offering. It wasn't just protection, it was a life, a dangerous life, that she would never be able to leave behind. I never wanted any of this, she said softly. But now that you're here, I don't know how to walk away. Lorenzo's expression softened, and for the briefest moment, Elena saw the man beneath the mask, the man who wasn't just a mafia kingpin, but someone who had been broken and was trying to rebuild himself. Then don't walk away, he said quietly. Stay with me, and let me protect you. The sound of footsteps from outside the apartment made Elena's heart skip a beat. The storm was no longer just a feeling in the air. It had arrived, and it was coming for them. The silence of the apartment was now a familiar comfort to Elena. The chaos of the past few days had settled into a routine of sorts. Tommy had adjusted to their new life, the once constant questions about Lorenzo, now replaced with a tentative sense of normalcy. Elena, however, found herself walking the fine line between fear and resolve, between wanting to protect Tommy and knowing that she couldn't go back. And in the middle of it all was Lorenzo, the man she had pulled from the fire, the man who had once ruled the underworld and now lay broken, forced to rebuild not only his body, but the empire he had lost. Watching him recover had been a strange experience. He wasn't just healing physically. There was something in the air, an unspoken shift as Lorenzo's calculating mind began to work again. Elena could almost feel the tension rising around him, the subtle but growing power that pulsed beneath the surface. Lorenzo sat by the window, his gaze distant, his fingers tracing the rim of a glass of water. His body had healed enough that he could sit up without assistance, though his muscles still ached. His breathing was steady, but his eyes, his storm gray eyes, seemed to always be searching, calculating. It was as if the world outside the window, the city that never slept, was both a battlefield and a chessboard, each move determined by his will. The cracks in the facade of the Mafia kingpin were beginning to close. The man who had once been betrayed by his closest allies, left to burn in a warehouse, was starting to reassert his control. And that control wasn't just over his physical body. It was over the city, over his empire, over his destiny. Lorenzo had spent days in silence, recuperating. But Elena knew that the silence wasn't because of weakness. It was because he was calculating. His mind never stopped. Even now, as he stared out of the window, Elena could sense the storm brewing inside him, the fury building within as he slowly but surely reclaimed what had once been his. He was more than a survivor. He was a predator, biding his time. "You're quiet today," Elena said softly from across the room, her voice breaking the stillness. Lorenzo didn't turn to look at her, his focus still on the distant city skyline. His response was measured, his voice low. "I'm not a man to be left down for long, Elena. I will rebuild what they tried to take." She had learned to listen to the weight of his words, to feel the undertones of violence that lay beneath his calm exterior. Lorenzo De Luca wasn't just angry, he was an unstoppable force, and when he set his mind to something, there was nothing that could stand in his way. Elena sat down on the couch across from him, her fingers twisting the edge of a blanket. "And what about us?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I didn't ask for this, Lorenzo. I didn't want any of this. But now we're in it," he interrupted, his voice hard but not unkind. He turned to look at her then, his eyes locking with hers. There was no apology in them, but there was something else, something that made Elena's heart beat a little faster. "I never asked you to be a part of this life, but you saved me. And now I'll make sure no one harms you or your son. I'll make sure of it." The weight of his words hung in the air, and for a moment Elena felt a strange mixture of fear and gratitude. Lorenzo was more than the monster the world believed him to be. He was a man who had been broken and was slowly piecing himself together. A man who understood what it meant to lose everything. And in the process of rebuilding, he had found something else. Something he hadn't expected to find. A connection with her. Elena didn't know what to make of it. She had saved him out of kindness, out of a sense of right and wrong, but now that kindness had turned into something more complicated. The door to their apartment creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. Elena looked up to see Leo Falcone, Lorenzo's consigliere, and the man who had remained by his side even in his weakest moments. Leo was the opposite of Lorenzo, calm, composed, and far more methodical. Where Lorenzo was a force of nature, Leo was a patient strategist, always a step ahead. "Boss," Leo greeted, his voice low but respectful. "We need to talk." Lorenzo didn't flinch at the title. He merely nodded and gestured for Leo to continue. Elena watched them closely, noting the tension that had built in the room since Leo's arrival. "We've located Sergei," Leo began, his expression grim. "He was the one who betrayed you. He's the one who sold you out to Olaf." Lorenzo's face hardened, his eyes narrowing as Leo's words sank in. Sergei had been one of his most trusted enforcers, a man who had stood by him through countless operations. The betrayal cut deep, and Lorenzo knew the consequences of this treachery would be far-reaching. "And what's next?" Lorenzo's voice was quiet, but the ice in it sent a shiver down Elena's spine. Leo's gaze shifted to Elena, then back to Lorenzo. "We make sure he pays. He's been hiding out in one of Olaf's safe houses. The time to act is now." Lorenzo's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He didn't need to. His mind was already working, already formulating the plan. The pieces were falling into place. "Elena," Lorenzo said, his voice soft but steady, "this isn't just about me anymore. Sergei's betrayal is bigger than I thought. And it's not just me they're after. They're after you and Tommy too. I've brought this danger to your doorstep. And now I'm going to make sure it doesn't touch you." Elena's mind reeled. She had never imagined her life could spiral so far out of control. Every day had been a struggle, but this was something she hadn't prepared for. Lorenzo was dragging her and Tommy into a world she had tried so hard to avoid. "What do you mean after us?" Elena asked, her voice trembling slightly. "You've already—" Lorenzo cut her off. "Dmitri," he said, his voice like steel. "I know it was him. He's the one who betrayed me, who sold you and Tommy out to Olaf. And now he's gone too far." Elena's stomach dropped at the mention of Dmitri's name. She had never wanted him to be a part of this, but here he was, pulling her into the same dark world that had claimed so much of her life. Lorenzo continued, his eyes burning with cold fury. "I'll find him. He'll pay for what he's done. But first, we deal with Sergei." The next few days were a blur of planning and tension. Lorenzo was back to his calculating self, directing Leo and his men with precision, as if nothing had changed. But Elena could see the change in him. The vulnerability he had shown her in his weakened state was gone, replaced by the cold, ruthless man who had built an empire on fear and control. Lorenzo's empire, the one he had built over years of blood and sweat, was slipping through his fingers. He could feel it. Olaf was gaining ground, and with the betrayal of his own men, Lorenzo's grip on power was weakening. But he wasn't going down without a fight. Elena stayed close to Tommy, keeping him occupied and away from the dangers that now loomed large in their lives. But she couldn't escape the reality that Lorenzo had become an indelible part of their world. Every decision, every action he took affected them. And the more she saw him reclaim his power, the more she realized how much she had come to rely on him. Not just as the man who had saved her, but as the man she was now tied to, for better or for worse. The storm was no longer a distant threat. It was here, and it was going to change everything. As the days wore on, Lorenzo's plan for retribution took shape. He was ready to strike, to reclaim his throne from those who had betrayed him. But the hunt for Dmitri was still unfinished, and the revelation of his involvement with Olaf made Elena's stomach churn with dread. The final confrontation was coming, and Elena had no idea what the cost would be for her and for Tommy. The storm was growing louder, and there was no turning back. Elena sat by the window, staring out at the city as it bathed in the warm glow of the afternoon sun. Everything felt wrong, like the world was tipping on its axis, and she was powerless to stop it. Her hands trembled slightly as she set her coffee cup down on the kitchen counter. Her life, the one she had built so carefully, was unraveling. There was no going back now, not after everything that had happened. The weight of it pressed down on her chest, suffocating her. But it wasn't the physical pain that had her paralyzed. It was the truth that had come to light, a truth about Dmitri that she had never wanted to believe. She had spent the last 2 years telling herself that her ex-husband, the man she had once loved, had simply disappeared. It had been easier to think of him as someone lost in the depths of the city's criminal underbelly, a casualty of the life he had chosen. But she was wrong. He hadn't vanished. He had betrayed her. And not just her. He had betrayed Lorenzo as well. Lorenzo, the man she had saved from the flames, the man she had once feared. Now he was no longer just the ruthless mafia boss. He had become something else. Someone she could no longer escape from. He was in their lives, whether she liked it or not. Lorenzo's anger had been building ever since the truth about Dimitri had been uncovered. But now it was more than just a simmering resentment. It was an all-consuming rage. His once calm demeanor had shattered, replaced by a cold fury that made Elena feel like she was standing on the edge of a precipice, staring down into an abyss. "He lied to me," Lorenzo had said, his voice low and dangerous, the words laced with venom. He had been pacing in the living room, his movements restless, as if he couldn't contain the storm inside him. "He betrayed me, Elena. He was supposed to be loyal." Elena didn't respond at first. She couldn't. She couldn't bring herself to say anything that might make it worse. Lorenzo was right. Dimitri had lied to him. He had sold both of them out to Victor Olaf, the same man who had tried to take Lorenzo's life, the same man who had now made Elena a target. But the betrayal went deeper than that. Dimitri's actions had set everything in motion. It wasn't just that he had betrayed Lorenzo's trust. It was that he had done so in the most personal way imaginable. He had sold them both out. He had put them in danger, not just with his ties to Olaf, but with the ripple effect of his choices. Elena's heart ached as the realization hit her. She had loved a man who had never really loved her. Dimitri had used her, just as he had used everyone else. The man she had once believed was her escape from this world was now the one who had dragged her deeper into it. "I should have known," Lorenzo muttered, running a hand through his dark hair, his eyes narrowed in frustration. "I should have known better. He was never to be trusted." Elena looked at him, her heart heavy with the weight of her own conflicting emotions. She had never fully understood the world Lorenzo lived in, the world he had been born into. She had never realized the depth of the darkness he had seen. But now, in the wake of Dimitri's betrayal, she was beginning to understand it. Lorenzo's world wasn't just a place of power and violence. It was a place where betrayal was the currency, where loyalty meant nothing unless it was paid for with blood. Dimitri's actions had made that crystal clear. The sound of the front door opening snapped Elena out of her thoughts. She looked up just in time to see Leo Falconi enter, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the tension that radiated from Lorenzo. The consigliere was always composed, always in control. But today even Leo seemed to carry the weight of the storm. "Boss," Leo said, his voice clipped but respectful. "We've found him." Lorenzo's eyes hardened, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "Where?" "He's hiding out at a safe house in the industrial district," Leo replied. "But it's not just Dimitri. We've confirmed that Victor Olaf's men are there too. They're waiting for the right moment to strike." Lorenzo's gaze flicked to Elena, his expression unreadable. "This ends now." Elena's stomach twisted as she felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had known that this moment would come, the moment when Lorenzo would go after Dimitri, after the man who had been the source of all their troubles. But now that it was here, she wasn't sure what to do. Her eyes met Lorenzo's, and in that moment she saw it. The storm of vengeance in his eyes, the need for retribution that had been building for days. He wasn't just going to take down Dimitri, he was going to destroy him. And with him, everything that Elena had ever known would be destroyed too. "I don't want you to go," Elena said quietly, her voice trembling with the weight of her words. "I don't want you to risk everything." Lorenzo's gaze softened, just a fraction. He took a step closer to her, his presence overwhelming. "You don't have a choice, Elena. Neither of us does." He paused, his voice quiet but intense. "Dimitri's betrayal doesn't just threaten me. It threatens you. It threatens Tommy. And I won't let that happen." Elena swallowed, her throat tight with the emotions that threatened to choke her. Lorenzo was right. She had already stepped into a world she had never wanted to be a part of. And now she had to make a choice. The choice was simple, and yet it was the hardest decision of her life. Elena had always been afraid of this world, the violence, the lies, the betrayals. She had spent her entire life trying to keep Tommy away from it. But now she was faced with the stark reality that this world wasn't something she could simply run from anymore. Lorenzo had brought her into it. He had pulled her out of the flames, and now she was bound to him in a way that couldn't be undone. Her heart was heavy as she looked at him, the man who had saved her, but who had also dragged her deeper into the darkness. He wasn't just the mafia boss she had thought him to be. He was someone more complex, more human, and that was what terrified her the most. "I can't protect Tommy from this," she whispered, her voice filled with resignation. "I can't protect him from you, from the choices we're making." Lorenzo's eyes softened, his features hardening with something Elena couldn't quite place. "I'll protect you both," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'll protect Tommy. But you have to understand, Elena, there's no turning back." And in that moment, Elena knew. There was no turning back. The storm was here. It was no longer just an impending threat. It had already arrived, and Elena had to decide whether she would face it head-on or turn her back on it entirely. Lorenzo had given her a choice, but the truth was, she had already made it when she chose to save him. She couldn't walk away from him now, not after everything. She had stepped into this world, and now she would face the consequences, whatever they might be. As the clock ticked down to the final confrontation, Elena knew one thing for sure. Her decision was made. She would stay by Lorenzo's side. But as they prepared for the final confrontation with Dmitri and Victor Olaf, she couldn't shake the feeling that something far worse was on the horizon. The storm wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The night had fallen thick over the city, the kind of night that held a sharp edge, heavy with anticipation, pregnant with the promise of something dangerous. The streets were empty, silent, as if the city itself had learned to hold its breath, waiting for what was to come. Elena stood by the window of their temporary safe house, staring out into the dark expanse of the industrial district. Her heart raced with a strange mixture of fear and resolve. The time had come. Lorenzo was ready. His plan had taken shape over the past few days, his mind working with cold precision, every move calculated. The warehouse, the one where the final confrontation would unfold, was in a desolate corner of the city, abandoned and perfect for a trap. It was a place where the Mafia's underworld could collide, where secrets could be buried, and where vengeance could be exacted. Elena's thoughts were interrupted as the door to the small room opened, and Lorenzo entered. His presence filled the space, commanding and unwavering. He was dressed in black, a sleek suit that seemed to melt into the shadows of the room, the kind of suit that carried both power and menace. His storm gray eyes, once so distant, now held a focus that Elena couldn't look away from. "Are you ready?" Elena asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Lorenzo met her gaze, his jaw set with the same determined strength that had carried him through the darkest corners of the city. He had never looked more like the man who ruled the underworld, yet there was something more in his eyes now, a sense of finality, as if the culmination of everything that had happened was about to be sealed in this one moment. "Ready," he said, his voice low and steady. "Tonight everything changes." Elena swallowed hard. She had never wanted this world for Tommy. She had never wanted to expose him to the violence and cruelty of the mafia life. But here she was, standing beside Lorenzo, the man who had pulled her and Tommy into this world. He had saved her once, but now he was taking her into the heart of the storm. Her heart ached for Tommy, who was fast asleep in the next room, blissfully unaware of the danger that loomed. But it was too late to turn back now. Lorenzo's plan was simple, yet devastatingly effective. The trap was set. The bait was in place. Dmitri, the man who had been the source of their pain, was the key to this final showdown. The information had come from Leo, Lorenzo's ever-loyal consigliere. They had found Dmitri hiding out in a warehouse, a safe house in the heart of Olaf's territory. And now Victor Olaf, the man who had once plotted Lorenzo's death, was about to walk straight into the trap. "Victor will come," Lorenzo said, breaking Elena's reverie. "He always thinks he's in control. He won't know what hit him." There was no mercy in Lorenzo's voice, only the cold, undeniable certainty of a man who had suffered and was now exacting his retribution. His eyes flickered to the small hallway where Tommy was tucked away in his room, the innocence of his sleep a stark contrast to the violence that was about to unfold. You're sure that this will work? Elena asked, though she already knew the answer. She had seen the cold calculations in Lorenzo's every movement, but she had to ask. She had to understand why he was willing to sacrifice everything for this. It will, Lorenzo said, his voice hardening. Olaf will come. Dmitri will lead him here. And when they do, they'll be met by everything I've built. His gaze hardened. Everything they thought they destroyed. Elena and Lorenzo made their way to the warehouse, the darkness of the night enveloping them like a cloak. The tension between them was thick, but beneath it was an unspoken understanding, a bond forged not just by circumstance, but by something deeper. Lorenzo had saved her life, and now she was standing beside him, not as a helpless victim, but as someone who was ready to face the storm with him. As they arrived, the warehouse loomed ahead like a giant, silent sentinel. The eerie quiet of the place made Elena's skin crawl. It was like standing on the edge of a precipice, knowing that one step forward could be the end of everything. But Elena didn't flinch. Not anymore. Inside the warehouse, Lorenzo's men were in place, scattered around the shadows, ready to move at his command. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. Victor Olaf and his men were approaching. Lorenzo turned to Elena, his expression unreadable. Stay close, he said, his voice almost a command. But there was something more in it, a softness that she hadn't expected. Don't let anyone hurt you. I won't, she replied, her voice steady. She wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The sound of heavy boots grew louder, and Elena felt her heart thud in her chest. This was it. This was the moment that would define everything. Lorenzo stood tall, his body tense, his mind focused entirely on the task at hand. The trap had been set perfectly, but even so, Elena could see the intensity in his eyes, the weight of everything he had lost, everything he had fought for. And then they entered. Victor Olaf and his men walked into the warehouse, their arrogance and overconfidence evident in every step they took. They were here for the kill, and they didn't know that they had already walked into the lion's den. Lorenzo's voice broke the silence. Looking for something, Olaf? Victor Olaf froze, his eyes darting around the room. His expression shifted from surprise to disbelief as he realized the trap that had been laid for him. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. The cold fury in Lorenzo's eyes said everything. You thought you could kill me, Olaf, Lorenzo continued, his voice low and deadly. You thought you could take everything from me, but you were wrong. Before Victor could react, the bay doors slammed shut and armed men emerged from the shadows, surrounding Olaf and his crew. The moment of tension hung in the air like a blade, poised to strike. The final confrontation had begun. Victor drew his gun, but it was already too late. Lorenzo's men were everywhere, their weapons trained on Olaf and his men. The game was over, and it was Lorenzo who held the power now. Dmitri, Lorenzo said, his voice cutting through the silence. Come out. Dmitri, his face twisted in fear and betrayal, emerged from the shadows, his hands raised in surrender. He looked like a man who had been caught in his own web, a man who had thought he could escape the consequences of his actions, only to realize too late that the web was closing in around him. I never wanted this, Dmitri pleaded, his voice cracking. I thought I was doing the right thing. You were doing the right thing for yourself, Lorenzo said coldly. But you sold me out. You sold her out. You sold your own blood. Lorenzo's eyes locked onto Dmitri's, and for a brief moment, Elena saw the depth of the betrayal in his gaze. It wasn't just anger. There was something deeper, something darker. Dmitri had not only betrayed Lorenzo, but he had also torn apart the fragile thread of loyalty that had once bound them. Lorenzo took a step forward, his voice cold and final. You'll pay for what you've done, Dmitri, but not with death. You don't deserve that. The room went silent as Dmitri's fate was sealed. Through the chaos, Elena stood firm, watching as the violence unfolded around her. She had come into this world as a stranger, unsure of her place, uncertain of her choices. But now, as she watched Lorenzo take back what had been stolen from him, she understood. This was his world, and somehow she had found a place in it. She wasn't just a spectator anymore. She was part of this, part of the decision, part of the consequence. She had saved Lorenzo once. Now she would stand by him. She had chosen her path, and it wasn't just to survive, it was to fight. As the final moments of the confrontation played out, Lorenzo's gaze shifted from Dmitri to Elena. He saw the change in her, the strength that had emerged in the face of danger. And for the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't expected. It wasn't just vengeance that had driven him. It was the connection he had found with her. "I couldn't have done this without you," Lorenzo said quietly, his voice softening as he spoke to Elena. "You gave me something I thought I had lost. My humanity." Elena's heart tightened as she met his gaze. She had stepped into his world, but in the process, she had found something unexpected. A man who had once been cold and ruthless, now transformed by the kindness she had shown him. As the warehouse quieted and the last remnants of the storm settled, Elena knew that this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what came next. Whatever storm Lorenzo had unleashed, she would face it with him, side by side. The battle for their future had just begun. Lorenzo De Luca stood at the penthouse window, his back to the room, staring out at the city below. The skyline had always been a reminder of his power, a constant, unyielding symbol of the empire he had built with blood and ruthlessness. But now, standing here, in the silence of a city that never seemed to sleep, Lorenzo felt a weight heavier than ever before. Victor Olaf was gone, Dmitri exiled. His enemies had been eliminated or neutralized, but the price of loyalty was far steeper than he had anticipated. The men he had trusted, the men he had once called brothers, had betrayed him. And now, with everything in place, he was left to pick up the shattered pieces of a world he had fought so hard to build. But it wasn't just power he had reclaimed. It was something else, something deeper, something more fragile. Elena and Tommy. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting Elena's as she stepped into the room. She had always been a mystery to him, someone he never expected to find, someone whose kindness had sparked something inside him that he hadn't known was still alive. Elena, the woman who had saved him from the flames, was now the heart of his new world. "You look lost," Elena said softly, her voice a calming presence in the otherwise tense room. She approached him cautiously, her eyes searching his face for something, perhaps for the man she had come to know, or perhaps for the man he used to be. "I am," Lorenzo admitted, his voice rough with exhaustion. "I've rebuilt my empire, but I don't know if it's worth the cost anymore." He paused, his gaze flicking to the hallway where Tommy was playing with his toys, blissfully unaware of the shadows that still lingered around them. "It's not just power I've won back. It's the people I've hurt along the way, the lives I've ruined." Elena stepped closer, her presence grounding him in a way nothing else could. "You've changed," she said quietly, a small, knowing smile tugging at her lips. "You're not the same man who walked into my life, Lorenzo. You're not the same man who killed to get to the top." He gave a small, rueful laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Maybe not, but I've had to fight every day to get where I am. I've made enemies, and I've paid the price for that. But now it's not just about vengeance. It's about protecting you, protecting Tommy." Elena reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm in a simple gesture of reassurance. "And you will protect us. I believe that. But we have to move forward. We can't keep looking back." Lorenzo's return to power hadn't come without consequences. The city had settled into an uneasy calm after the fall of Victor Olaf, but Lorenzo knew better than anyone that the calm was only temporary. His empire, rebuilt in the ashes of betrayal, was still fragile. The moment someone sensed weakness, it would all come crashing down again. Lorenzo had learned that the Mafia world, the world he had ruled for so long, was full of sharks that never stopped circling. His men, though loyal, were always looking for an opportunity to take power for themselves. Leo, his consigliere, was a constant shadow at his side, but even Leo knew that the loyalty of men in this world could be as fickle as the wind. And Elena and Tommy, they were his anchor, but they were also his greatest vulnerability. His enemies, those who had betrayed him, would come for them if they knew how much Lorenzo had changed. His protection was no longer just about keeping his seat at the top. It was about keeping them safe, and the world he had built didn't operate on the rules of kindness and compassion. It thrived on fear, loyalty, and ruthlessness. The decision to leave the penthouse, to move away from the city and the criminal life that had defined him, wasn't one Lorenzo had made lightly, but Elena had made him see something he had refused to confront for so long. He was more than his past, more than the empire he had built. He could still choose a different path. Elena, Lorenzo began, his voice low, almost hesitant, you've given me a reason to fight for something more, for a life that's different. I don't want to bring Tommy into this world of blood and betrayal. Elena studied him for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. I know, and I don't want to live in this world either. But we have to carve out a life for ourselves, Lorenzo. We can't keep running from the past. We have to face it together. Lorenzo nodded, a sense of clarity settling over him. He had been a king, feared and revered, but now he was a man in search of something more, something worth living for. And he had found that in Elena and Tommy. We can start over, he said, his voice firm with determination. We'll leave the city behind. I'll put the past to rest. It's time for a new beginning. The decision to leave the shadows of the city, to leave behind the life that had been built on a foundation of fear and bloodshed, was the hardest decision Lorenzo had ever made. But it was also the most liberating. As the days passed, Lorenzo's transformation became even more evident. He was no longer the ruthless Mafia kingpin who had crushed his enemies without hesitation. He was a man determined to make things right, to rebuild his life and the family he had once lost in his pursuit of power. It wasn't easy. The transition was filled with moments of doubt, moments when the ghosts of his past threatened to rise up and pull him back into the world he had fought so hard to escape. But every time that happened, he would look at Elena and Tommy, and the strength in their eyes would remind him of why he was doing this. They were his future now. And for the first time in his life, Lorenzo believed in the possibility of a different path. It wasn't Maimt, the small house they had bought in the quiet outskirts of the city. It wasn't a penthouse or a mansion. It was simple, modest, but it was theirs. The walls were bare, still waiting to be filled with the memories they would create. The rooms were small, but they were filled with laughter and love. Things Lorenzo hadn't known he craved until Elena and Tommy had entered his life. Tommy had quickly taken to the new house, his boundless energy filling the space with excitement. Elena, too, seemed to find a quiet peace in the simplicity of their new life, though Lorenzo knew she still carried the weight of their past with her. He could see it in the way she looked at him sometimes, the silent questions in her eyes that she never spoke aloud. She didn't fully trust that the life they were building was permanent, that it was real. But Lorenzo knew this was the only way forward. He had learned the hard way that power, loyalty, and fear could only take you so far. In the end, what mattered most were the people you loved, the people you chose to fight for. As he stood outside, watching Tommy chase after a ball in the yard, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The past was still there, lurking in the shadows. But for the first time, he didn't feel like he was being hunted. He felt free. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light across the small yard. Lorenzo stood at the back door, his arms folded across his chest, watching as Elena knelt down to tie Tommy's shoelaces. The world felt still, as if it had stopped spinning for just a moment to let them have this. In the distance, the city loomed, its lights twinkling like 1,000 stars. But it felt so far away now, like another life, another world. The world of shadows, of blood and betrayal was behind them. Elena stood and looked up at him, a small smile playing on her lips. It's not perfect, she said softly, but it's ours. Lorenzo's gaze softened as he stepped toward her, his hand reaching out to take hers. It's more than I ever thought I deserved. Together they turned to watch Tommy, his laughter echoing in the evening air as he ran across the yard, his innocence a stark contrast to the darkness that had once consumed them all. Lorenzo pulled Elena close, his heart swelling with something he hadn't known he could feel. Hope. The kind of hope that comes from redemption, from love, from the smallest light that pierces the darkest shadows. In a world full of shadows, he whispered, sometimes all it takes is a single light to lead the way. And for the first time, Lorenzo believed that light wasn't just a fleeting thing. It was their future. Lorenzo De Luca had once been a king, a man who ruled the underworld with fear and power. But through Elena's compassion, he had been given a chance to rediscover his humanity and rebuild the life he had lost. Elena, too, had come a long way. From the woman who had saved a man she never thought she could love, to the woman who now stood by his side, carving out a future for their family. Together, they had faced the darkness, and together they had found a way out. The past would always be with them, but the future was theirs to create. And in the end, it was not power or vengeance that defined them. It was love. And in that love, they had found the strength to move forward, to build a life free of the shadows that had once controlled them. The story of Lorenzo, Elena, and Tommy wasn't one of kings and empires, but of redemption, loyalty, and the power of compassion in a world that often seemed too dark to navigate. But they had found their way, one step at a time, and for that they would always be grateful. If you enjoyed this journey of redemption, love, and betrayal, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of unexpected heroes and powerful transformations. Don't forget to comment below with your thoughts. What would you do if you were in Elena's shoes? Would you risk everything for someone who once lived in the shadows? Share your opinion with us, and let's keep the conversation going. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the smallest light can guide the way through even the darkest storms.